So, Ben, welcome to the Better World Leaders podcast. And thank you for making the time from homeschooling for a little while.
Pleasure to escape for a while.
So Ben is a a really fantastic and inspiring individual, as you're soon going to hear. But rather than hear it from me, having just done a brief introduction already, Ben, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself and sort of really, I suppose the deepest question is where do you come from?
It's always a good question. So I'm a Aboriginal man from New South Wales. So my family on two streams. My pop side of the family are Bowens from up Queensland way. And my nan side of the family are the Keys. So they're from Western New South Wales. So a Wiradjuri family there, but they also tie into Gandagara, which goes down sort of into Sydney and into the South Coast on the highlands there. So that's my cultural heritage. So come from a long line of heritage in Aboriginal sphere, and they've grown up within the Aboriginal community within Sydney in particular, and are lucky enough to live and work in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities now, and work in international First Nations all around the world now.
Mate, and we're going to get right into all of that, and I'll take this opportunity to thank you for everything that you've shared with me and my family in terms of your knowledge and experience, and helped us understand the beautiful country that we spend our time as custodians of down here on the South Coast. And in terms of your sort of growing up and your sort of earliest time sort of leading, come on, Ben, tell us about your altering.
Well, I wasn't that young then, so I thought when you were talking about young, I was going back to my
we can
childhood.
have a different conversation on a different day about childhood and ski fields and all that fun stuff, but this is a business conversation. Let's talk about your sort of earliest time working. So
I mean, growing up as part of an Aboriginal family, we grew up working from a really young age, actually. So I think my first job, which was illegal, was working for my mum's business, stocking shelves and stuff. So look, that started from, I think about 8 or 9, we started having to work there on odd days, but it sort of led me into a career, whereas not a traditional career path. I sort of stumbled through school and then got out and was loving my footy and water polo and all those sort of sports, but ended up through injury falling into cycling and triathlon, and was lucky enough that a couple of people actually put a bit of weight behind my lack of ambition, I guess would be the best way to do it, and put me overseas, and ended up enjoying a professional career in triathlon and cycling, which took me around the world and sort of opened me up to a whole range of experiences, and probably experiences that allowed me to reflect back on my own skills and shortcomings in particular, but own skills and cultural upbringing that gave me a unique sort of understanding of what I could bring to the world.
And after that, career was sort of, unfortunately, sort of brought to a close by a forward drive
car
on the freeway. Where did you then decide to apply yourself?
Well, funnily enough, my gorgeous wife is smart and a lot smarter than I am. So when I was out actually racing for a living, she actually took me back into university and studying and having something to back up for. And lucky, within my second year of university, I actually got hit by that said car and was laying around for a couple of weeks with broken vertebra and shoulders and everything else, and actually basically walked straight into an education degree, which was lucky. So I sort of moved from this sort of performance, understanding how to get the best out of myself and those around me, and how to decode other people, which is basically what racing is trying to figure out where people's strengths and weaknesses are and trying to break them, into a education world where you're trying to build up young people and try to decode their strengths and weaknesses and figure out how to scaffold that stuff together and help them build their own knowledge and their own worldview.
And in particular, let's talk about shared paths. So how are you applying all that learning of, helping people leverage their strengths and development areas and sort of take that out into the world?
Yeah, so shared path it's we sort of call it the end point of the journey for us now, which is a bit scary seeming. I don't feel that old. But it's the end point for us at the moment, I guess, until we redesign everything. And shared path is bringing a lot of the learning we had through professional sport, through education, through growing up in Black communities, to working with governments, to working within education institutions. It's bringing a lot of our frustrations and a lot of our wins and everything together into one business place where we started looking at a world, instead of focusing on eliminating a single problem, we actually started looking at the chaining of those problems together and then looking at larger world solutions. So the catalyst for a shared path was me and my business partner, Sean Appo, were working within the Close the Gap strategy in Australia around eliminating tobacco and increasing exercise and working with diabetes and food and all this sort of stuff in our communities. And
So this is all in Aboriginal communities in Australia?
Yeah, and it was always focused on get people in the door, tell them not to smoke, tell them not to eat crappy food, and tell them to exercise. And as everyone knows, if I'm sitting there lecturing you on what not to do, that's exactly what you're going to go do just to spite me. And
yeah, the least effective way to change behaviour for positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we started looking at the upstreaming model. So instead of looking at tobacco as the problem to solve, we actually started looking at tobacco and exercise and food as in the end behaviours of a bigger problem. And what was the common problem around that? And it was lack of access to culture. It was low socioeconomics. It's stress factors. It's bad management practices as well. So, at the time we were working in Redfern and we were told to get people off smokes and lecture them about tobacco. At the same time, we had the block change over there where people were getting moved out of housing and moved to totally different neighbourhoods and had unsecure housing. And we were sitting there going, well, that's just a stress factor, and they're using cigarettes as a management tool for that. So if we take away cigarettes now, we're actually taking away people's only stress management tool. So we needed to look at going upstream and figuring out, well, how do we build communities? How do we build support networks around people so that they can use that as their stress management rather than the cigarettes? And we looked at that for a range of things, and we looked at the, using culture of, we could have a 50 cigarette smoking habit a day with an elder, take them out fishing or take them spearfishing, and that elder wouldn't touch a cigarette the whole day, because when they're in that environment, there was no key factors that triggered it. So we sort of had this light bulb moment there, saying we can change huge outcomes by looking at really small solutions. And small solutions as in taking someone's fishing is not that hard to do, but the outcome for that person and changing their life and that the moment or 24 hours to reflect on what their behavior meant or what they could do from there to change their long-term health, that's a massive outcome. So shared paths then sort of spurned on from that, saying one of the key things we saw for people was, in Australia in particular, we lecture about this lifelong journey of you go to school, you get your diplomas and you get your high school certificates, and then you go on to universities, and then come out of university and you get a job, and then you work at that job for a long time, you get long service leave, and then the job rewards you. Then after a lifetime of effort, you retire, and then you have this lovely lifestyle. And as an Aboriginal fellow growing up, we know that's not true. We don't finish school at the same rates. We're one of the highest qualified communities on Cert 4s out of TAFE, but it hasn't translated into work for us. So we know there's a range of other issues going on. So we started to move away from this lecture of getting kids to school and, telling parents, well, they should just go and get a job and work for 50, 60 years of their life so they can get a retirement, to what do people actually want to do, or what is the lifestyle that they want, and how do we redefine that into a business sense? So if a community wants to job share or create a social enterprise where 3 or 4 families are working together to create an income that they can then distribute within their own community, that's perfectly fine. If a community only wants to open 3 days a week and that's all they have to work to create a lifestyle and a housing solution that they want, that's fine. So we really geared Shared Path up to targeting this business world and social enterprise world to allow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and international First Nation families to look at what they actually want to achieve, what was the balance between work and economics and culture and law and all these big key areas of their identity, and how can we create an enterprise model around that allowed them to blend and find the right mix so that they were happy in the area they were building sustainable growth, and they were ensuring the long-term survival of their communities.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I mean, in a way, I can see the alignment, with many of the sort of the corporate, sort of leaders that I've worked with over the last sort of 15 years, that more than anything else, what I think a lot of leaders are lacking is purpose. So you're helping, sort of, at least what I'm, sort of receiving from that, sort of phase of Shared Pathways, is you're helping people focus on what they actually want, what their purpose is, and then doing what they need to do to achieve that, as opposed to looking around at what everybody else is doing, what everybody else has got, or what they're being told they should go get, and just focusing on the outcome, and then just sort of relentlessly exhausting yourself and sort of, bashing your head against the world just to get what, somebody else is telling you should go and get. So you've just touched there on the international work, and I appreciate that, this has been, as much as it's a couple of 3 years now, but it's been a more recent thing. And when we were talking before we hit record, you were actually due to be in Manhattan this week, sort of back with the UN again. So just sort of tell us a little bit more about the work that you're now doing with Shared Path internationally with the UN and Microsoft.
Yeah, so the work we were supposed to be, as you said, supposed to be in the UN headquarters in New York City this week, actually, over the Easter break and for a couple of weeks. And it was supposed to be a big trip for us. One, it's the First Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, which it's a massive 2 weeks of First Nation people from around the world that come in, and we get the UN to ourselves, and we actually raise a lot of issues that are going around. So it's a key sort of 2 week period that we get together, and we can sort of, I guess for lack of a better word, it's the spitballing, and we can share concepts and learnings, and it's almost like a big ceremony time, really. It's a really powerful 2 weeks, and it's an exhausting 2 weeks. So there's almost a bit of relief that we're not there, because I would be sort of hiding my hotel room probably about now, trying to get my head back into some resemblance of a functional unit. But it's the work we do there it's really around working with Indigenous communities around technology and the threat of technology, and also the opportunity of technology. So it's our communities are predominantly, and when I say our communities, I mean around the world, are predominantly consumers of technology. So we don't produce or program very much. So a lot of the stuff we get is built by a very slim sector of the global population, and that sector is mainly middle to older white gentlemen. So the world view of how technology is used is pretty limited. So, and the perfect example of that is up till last year, most of us who wear biotechnology like watches and stuff that track our heart rates and stuff like that wouldn't have been aware that most female body functions weren't actually accommodated within that technology. So it was only last year that they actually started looking at tracking menstruation rates and giving people more biometrics around those sort of measurements. So it sort of goes to show this limited developer sector. But when we looked at that Indigenous community over there, it was understanding that they were trying to hash together a range of technologies to build things that they needed, or share information to a global network, or using YouTube to share video content and all this sort of stuff. And the work we sort of stumbled into over there was understanding that people really didn't understand the technology itself. So one, they weren't getting the most out of it. But two, they were opening their communities to a whole bunch of vulnerability around data theft and cybersecurity and leaking of information. And it, you know, to the point of some really heartbreaking stats that we're working with some First Nation women in America, where they were giving us stats that it was in every 3 minutes, one woman was going missing in their communities through outsiders coming in and kidnapping these women. And you know, and if they weren't found within, I think it was like a 15 or 20 minute window, then they were never found again. So like just horrifying stats, which unfortunately we know from around the world in other communities, these stats are true. And looking at how perpetrators were using technology and that sort of stuff to track people and figure out when they were vulnerable and all this sort of stuff opened us out to training those communities on how to either eliminate those technologies from their communities, or how to use that technology to better support themselves by creating safe networks and you know, community watch programs where they could use wearable technology, which was traditional beading jewelry, which then had GPS trackers in it, which had alert buttons and e-perps and stuff embedded in it, that if something was happening, they could, or they felt unsafe, they could hit these technology buttons within their traditional jewelry to alert people within their safe network. So just some really interesting projects. And then off the back of that, we started looking at the bigger stuff, which was really brought to the forefront in Australia over the past summer with our bushfire season. So what was highlighted in the Sydney bushfires this year was this drive around environmental management. And internationally, we understand that 80% of biodiversity is held within First Nation countries. So First Nation controlled land does contain this huge richness of biodiversity and is the key to managing what the world is going through in terms of trying to create a sustainable environment. So we're looking at now, working with mob from all over the world, that how we can use technology to better enable them to collect the data that they already know to be true. How do they can analyze data and start building projects out so they can start taking control of a lot of this international efforts. And some of the stuff we've been talking about in Australia as well, that, you know, we can build sensors and create networks over here that we can track. And we've been doing it in Queensland, where we can track pollutants in a river off a $20 circuit, that we can figure out what chemicals and what fertilizers are in the water and what's the water quality, track that back to a farming station that we know it's come from, and then figure out how many of those pollutants are getting on the Great Barrier Reef and how that impact is going on. So our communities actually understand this stuff, and they've got the knowledge over thousands of years of understanding water flows and the impacts and the changing environment. But the data that scientists are working on now is very limited. They've only got a couple of 100 years worth of understanding and hard numbers. So we're looking at building that database by using and empowering our communities to draw back into that lived experience and start to unpack a lot of that stuff, put it into data models, build businesses, empower themselves, look at carbon trade schemes to generate income into their communities off practices that they're already doing with cultural burn-offs, looking at traditional foods and how they can best manage those traditional foods and market them and create sustainable businesses. So it's a huge sector. It's it's a sector that Shared Path is in no way driving or controlling. It's really a sector that we're partnering with global institutions like Tribal Link from the New York and Project Access and stuff like that from the UN to really work their networks and connect their networks and provide support to help them support their communities to build this stuff out.
I mean, that's just incredible to think that there's so much, sort of opportunity, for, Aboriginal communities locally and First Nations communities globally to basically get involved with this, sort of very clearly recognized need to, sort of make things better. And actually, in many ways, it's about, sort of leaning into, sort of the knowledge that, you and Tribal Link and others have had, and it's just essentially been ignored or discounted or, sort of degraded. And if we can just kind of basically tune in and pay some attention, potentially a lot of good can come. I mean, it's certainly, one of the most sort of influential and inspirational books that I've read, I think probably ever, is one that you put me onto, Bruce Pascoe's, sort of Dark Emu, and just really sort of understanding how long, sort of agricultural practices, have been established in Australia, baking bread before the Egyptians, etc., etc. And then to see in Paul Hawkins' great book Drawdown, which certainly to my view is one of the most comprehensively positive, sort of solution orientated, sort of mission statements on managing climate. One of the key things he's talking about in there is basically moving back to more of the First Nations based agricultural practices and land management practices. So that's all wrapped up together.
Look, absolutely, and it's even in the midst of this COVID-19 stuff, and we know that this is another cofactor of this colonization and westernization of a world, that we're growing at a rate and we're changing practices for this consumption ability rather than building practices. So it's and I know this one's come out of China around those, but we've had them come out of America around pig farming. UK has had that around mad cow disease. Australia is on the brink of it with this stuff around the way that we've over-farmed chickens and pigs and stuff in this country and used antibiotics for years to try to starve off some of these viruses growing and bacteria growing. So look, a lot of this stuff is interconnected, and this goes back to some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier, which is, instead of looking at solving the COVID-19 crisis, we are trying to look upstream at, we know what the drivers are getting us into these positions like climate change are. We know what the answers are, but we need to create the solution that has the whole chain, not just one link of the chain, because one link of the chain can give us a quick result, but it doesn't sustain us for very long. So what you're talking about with Uncle Bruce's stuff with Dark Emu is that there's so much opportunity in there, not only in a business sense around traditional grains and that sort of farming process, but we know through carbon storage and those solutions that there's huge amounts of carbon storage value that's embedded into those traditional crops, and traditional crops around the world for First Nations people all do have large carbon storage solutions built into them, large root structures, seagrasses, and all that sort of biotechnology that's in them.
Yeah.
And by actioning those items off building better food sources and more sustainable food sources, we're actually tackling that climate change. We're actually tackling lower water usage on crops to build this stuff. So and that's what the key for us is finding the data and finding the solution that links a whole range of projects together for a bigger outcome on the end problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to sort of circle slightly. Something's been, I suppose, really kind of at the back of my mind as I've been listening to everything that that you've been saying. I mean, and there is this circularity, and there is this, you know, sort of integrated pattern to everything. What do you think is the sort of the driving sort of force that sort of in the first place called you to make this sort of contribution, both nationally and then internationally, and is it that same force that's driving you forward to use your own capability and resourcefulness to make the world better?
To be honest with you, I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think there's a concept.
Well, this is a podcast, so take your time.
Yeah, look, I think it's for us, it's, and not just to try to create a mystical answer around Aboriginality or cultural backgrounds, but it's a concept around. I was very lucky enough to grow up with my nan, who imparted a hell of a lot of wisdom before I was ready to understand it. And the way she sort of spoke about it was planting these seeds that when I was ready and had the ability to fertilize those seeds, they would regenerate, and, you know, and we'd go off with those ideas. And it's this concept of, in our culture, we're not an individual that's totally isolated. We're part of this collective that is understood that we all have a role, and not all of us are educators, not all of us are, you know, laborers, not all of us are thinkers, but together, that's how we achieve the bigger outcomes. And so I think for the work that I do now is I understand where my abilities are. I know what I can do and what I can't do, and where my weaknesses really lie. And it's the work that we do now is really about understanding how best I can contribute those skills to a global community, but then how best do I build teams that then can actually go out and achieve that sort of stuff. And it's a really hard concept, and it's a really, I guess, ego shocking concept to be able to sit in front of a large group of people at the UN and sort of say, look, I can't do this, but, you know, the person next to me or the person across the table is the person to do this. So can, you know, if they're going to put their hand up and do this, you know, what is my role? And sometimes my role is, you know, sitting on a Zoom call with them a couple of days a week to best encourage or support their process to achieve this sort of stuff. So it's understanding from a cultural perspective, you don't always have to be the one at the front of the room speaking. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one at the kettle making the cup of tea and bringing it to people, so that they don't have to leave that table to make a tea. They can be at that table having the conversation. So that's that sort of cultural heritage coming in to the way that I work, and the way that I see this sort of stuff growing is, you know, understanding I'm not the driver of this. I'm as much of a passenger as anyone else, but understanding when it's the time to put my hand up and speak, and when it's the time just to shut up and make a cup of tea for someone so that they can speak.
And that for me is just such a perfect analogy of what leadership should be. You know, as a leader, your biggest job is to make other leaders, you know, to be a creator, you know, of great leadership. And a lot of the time that involves stepping away and stepping back from the light and letting other people shine, you know, and eating last and speaking last, and, you know, sort of asking more questions and then listening. So no, it's great. It's great to hear you say that, mate. And, you know, again, I think there's such an opportunity, you know, for the sort of the collective, you know, Australian population to learn, you know, from the you know, the sort of the culture and the knowledge that, you know, that you're sharing, and then the world more generally, you know, to learn from the cultural markers. And I mean, I think there is maybe a slight deviation, if not a turn, you know, sort of globally at the moment to recognize what leadership is and should be, and that it is based more on this sort of, you know, community based ethos, and it's not about the man up front and the man on the pedestal, despite what certain you know, sort of world leaders might be saying at the moment. I think at the grassroots level there's a different recognition. If I could ask you one thing specifically, I mean, how important do you think the role of leaders is in making the world better? You know, is it a leadership thing or is it an everybody thing?
Once again, where do you start with that one? I think it's an everybody thing, and I think understanding today's a very, very different environment. So through technology and social media, we all have a bigger platform. We all have a message that we can spread wide. So I think it's taken away that traditional top-down leadership model of, unfortunately with this COVID crisis, we keep hearing about, this is a wartime. Oh, I should premise, in Australia, we're hearing this, this is a wartime issue and, not since World War II, and creating systems where we have a singular body of so-called leadership that comes up with a policy and delivers it to the mass to then enact. That sort of environment's gone because people can mobilize smaller networks quite quickly. We can disenfranchise information very quickly. We can create false information very quickly now and spread it. So I think when we start looking at leadership, we really need to look at this collective leadership. That I think the role of a single leader is almost gone. I think it's understanding that leadership comes from pulling the levers of the team that you have. So, and as I said, sometimes it is sitting back and making that cup of tea, and it's understanding that the people around you have all got a network. They've all got a family. They've all got a social grouping that they can activate. So they all become leaders on their own network. So how do you best enable all those networks to distribute information or create momentum is about empowering that collective leadership rather than trying to be the solo voice at the top directing the traffic.
No, 100%. And again, it's about leaders creating leaders, and that leadership, is at a very, very local level. I mean, again, it's the sort of the right application of an innovation, in a social technology that can be used and abused very easily, or it can be enabling and empowering. It's all a question of what's the value system driving it.
And look, it's an interesting model because, obviously our personal connection, both of our young guys have started kindergarten, and I'm watching that dynamic within a schoolyard. And, having a teaching background, I've seen it before, but I haven't seen it so, I guess, from this perspective or this point of view. And I was looking at where my young fella has started school, and they're looking at the student representatives, and he's in kindergarten, and they want a student representative to represent their views and this sort of stuff. And you're sort of looking at it going, and I think that's the prime example of what we're looking at now, that it doesn't matter how micro the group is, there is still leadership being demonstrated in that. So I think now it's understanding how the hierarchy of groups and society and how they're intertwined and the chaining together of all these groups and how we connect and disconnect. It's understanding all those connection points or those hand-holding points that is the leadership. And it's understanding that, a 5-year-old in kindergarten who's the student rep is speaking for the other 28 kids in his class or her class. And that's a pretty powerful message that student is demonstrating the leadership at some level. So surely at a school level or at a parent group level or whatever it is, we should be supporting and empowering that voice to speak up, because that voice is speaking for 28 people. So it becomes this really interesting conversation to have about people that, by not empowering every type of leader or not empowering every voice in that, you are dispowering or you're discrediting huge population bases. So it's a really challenging point to make to people. And when it becomes around corporate offices and international conglomerates, it's really interesting to sort of talk to them. And some of the work we do with Shared Path is bringing this cultural protocols into leaderships into that structure is getting them to understand that they should be empowering the leadership of community and consumers and customer groups, as well as the sales team, as well as their union, as well as their, you know, what they'd probably class as the lowest paid workers in terms of the cleaning stuff that comes through that office, because they all have a valid point of view or insight into that company and the process or how to make things better.
I mean, so just in terms of, you know, sort of the corporate side of your work, do you want to just talk a little bit about sort of what Shed Path do at an organisational level with corporates?
Yeah, so the interesting structure for us is we are a non-for-profit. So we've got DGR status in Australia, so it means that we can work off, obviously no tax, but we work off a donation base. But part of our thinking when Sean and I got together on this idea was we really wanted to build an opportunity that we didn't have to have our hand out asking for money off people and have an unstable budget each year to design our project. So we decided to build a consulting business off the back of his work he'd done in public health and the work I'd done in business management and performance levels when I was a professional athlete, and bringing that learning into the business sector and then into education and building leadership teams within schools. We brought all that together to launch Shed Path Consulting Arm, which we actually go out to governments and large multinationals and even smaller businesses and work with them around communication strategies and building cultural practices and building better workplaces that are more accepting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, for one, but also creating or changing this idea of around scale and sustainability to not be this endless exponential growth to being something that, you know, every business should have a concept of where they need to get to be successful, and whether they need to keep going or not is something to be decided then. So we launched this arm to generate income for us so that we could reinvest that money back into our community projects around tech and business development for our communities. And one of the first projects we actually got was from a large multinational company, which we won't give the name, which couldn't manage the communication strategy from a CEO and leadership, or the board, we'll say the executive board, would put out a memo to the staff, which would then go to the management level, which then would go out to their individual project teams, which then go out to the nations, and then you know, right down to the lonely construction worker on the project would be giving this message that, you know, the CEO from another country in another language had said, you know, X, Y, and Z, this is what we want you to do. And they were finding that one of their biggest issue was they couldn't get a uniform or an agreed message out through any of their platforms, whether it be email, but whether it be letter, whether it be website or video message. It just wasn't reaching the individuals within the ground level the same, and it was being interpreted differently and being spun and this and that and the other. And the work that we pitched them was this understanding that, you know, in Australia context, Aboriginal people, well, minimum we've been here for 60,000 years. The number is rapidly growing out beyond 120 to arguably multiple hundreds of thousands of years now. So, but the interesting thing around our stories and our communication strategies is we have remained and we've maintained these stories of our law around country and events that have happened that are hundreds of thousands of years old, and they haven't changed. So when we walked into this company and started talking to them about the ways that we've set up communication strategies within our communities, that we've maintained an oral history across, you know, in Australia, we've got over 300 different Aboriginal languages and Torres Strait Islander languages. We've maintained those stories over these 300 different languages for hundreds of thousands of years without losing the detail. And they can't quite they can't grab that concept of how can you have Chinese whispers without losing or without someone messing up the content. And it's understanding that we started to build the communication in structure within a company to look at how they distributed information and where they had overlap in teams, and restructured communication strategies to speak to certain teams in together and then other teams together, and then where was overlap between those two teams, so that there was never a single team or a single person that had information that other people didn't have at the same time, which then stopped the individual teams disseminating that information or interpreting the information differently. And it was a really interesting project for us, because it was a big project, way bigger than Shared Path was, which was me and Sean just working from the local cafe with this multinational company. But it was understanding that these guys didn't quite get the concept that, you know, they could send an email out to a manager, and if that manager had an argument with their partner or had a rough drop off with the kids when they were getting to work, or, you know, was stuck in traffic and was stressed, and they opened up their email and they saw this message from the CEO, that their emotional state at that moment in time, and the fact that they were isolated and not being given information, is with a number of people around them to help absorb that information, was allowing them to internalize that information and then regurgitate it or reflect it in a different format, which then changed the message that then got reflected down. And that process could happen 50, 60 times before it got to someone on the ground. So that it's a really complex communication strategies that our communities have got embedded into them. And it comes to a point, and the simple way to explain it is, we see the I guess the traditional, or the, you know, the stereotypical thing of an elder sitting there with a bunch of kids and telling them a story. It's the concept that that group of kids may change, and you might have 10 kids in that first group who are talking, but the next group of 10 kids may have 3 from the original group that are in it. So that when that elder tells a story, even if that elder might change 1 or 2 words, there's still 3 kids that heard the first story as well as the second story, that then become a conduit between the 2 groups. And then so on and so forth, it goes on throughout that group. So throughout the lifetime of an elder telling that story, there's these conduits that are built into each group that then become the, I guess, the sanders of that story, that then take off the edges that are changed and bring it back to the common base. So they're really complex strategies. It's something that Western businesses haven't really thought about too much, and they really haven't thought about in the modern world, that, you know, with technology and deep fakes and all this sort of stuff that are running through them, that their messages can be corrupted very, very quickly. How they disseminate that information and create conduits between their different audiences is critical.
No, for sure. I think there's I mean, thank you for that. There's a heck of a lot to unpack in there, as always. But yeah, I think, you know, I think there's almost been an oversimplification of communication. And I see this, you know, sort of a lot as well, that, you know, sort of there's this pressure to make a message very concise and make it very specific. And I think a lot of the time what sort of gets left behind is the sort of the fundamental principles and the sort of the core ethos that the message, you know, sort of is supposed to be resonating. And that, you know, because, you know, you might change a CEO, you know, once every 5 years, or, you know, you might have a, you know, sort of a manager in a role for a year, and then they're bouncing off onto the next thing. That, you know, there's when the messages are overly simplified and there's not enough resonance around the key purpose of the message, that, you know, sort of as you compound that with the constant turbulence of a modern corporate, you know, the message just sort of comes in and bounces straight off. It doesn't land, and it doesn't sink. And as you've said, you don't have that sort of consistency. You don't have those sanders, to use that term, who can sort of intuit, because they've been exposed to the message repeatedly over time, when it is very consistent and very purposeful, that might be the message today, but this is what it's reflecting. And that might be the message that we got yesterday, but it's reflecting the same thing we had 3 weeks ago, and so on and so on. Just to sort of move, sort of towards the sort of the final couple of questions. You've touched on so many points today. We've talked about sort of technology. We talked about sort of indigenous land practices and the benefits of so much sort of First Nation culture globally, and Aboriginal culture specifically for Australia. If you could you disseminate just maybe 3 or 4 things that people listening to this could try and do and take on an initial slight behavioral shift, or a specific action item that people could do and deploy to sort of make a move towards adopting some of these beneficial strategies that you're trying to convey to the world? Just pick a couple and wrap them up as as concisely as it's possible to do.
Yeah, concise is not one of my strong points, let's face it, as people have heard today. Look, I'm rapidly going through my notes now. Look, I think for us, I think leadership is really a rabbit hole. You can follow things down it really quickly and get distracted, and we can lose what we're chasing very quickly. And I think in what we're seeing at the moment is probably a really good snapshot that when we're looking at leadership, we hate the over practice, over rehearsed delivery of information that we hear from some politicians and CEOs, and because it loses that human aspect of communicating to someone. You're not looking someone in the eye, or you've rehearsed your speech so much that when a question gets asked in a slightly different context for information, you can't answer that because you're not across your content, you're across your rehearsed speech. So what I'd really encourage people to do is start looking at how you ensure your human aspect of your communication, and it's looking at your vulnerability. And there's a lot of great examples of this sort of stuff, and I see it in our communities all the time, that we have not just our elders, but even younger people standing up and and looking down the barrel of a camera, or looking at an audience and delivering a personal story, or a really powerful image of why they're giving the information they're about to disseminate to you. And it gives you this context, and it gives you this person and this humanity that you're grabbing onto, this vulnerability, that then when you're getting the information, even if it's a little bit more rehearsed, it's given you this context of where it's come from. And that's a really powerful tool. It can be delivered really badly. And I think that's what we're seeing in the world of politics at the moment, where politicians try to create a false narrative around the background of their policies and then try to give it that way. But when you're honestly built into this model and you stand up in front of someone and deliver a message, I think that's probably the best way to gather a team around you, or give people that information where they can understand how to connect with you as a leader. That would be my number one point: vulnerability. The second ones I would touch on is understanding what leadership actually means to people. Is totally different, and it's touching back onto the technology now. We're in a period of data growth that's exponential, and we're tripling the rate of human data on basically a 3-day period now of history. So we're rapidly developing so much more data and content out there. How much of it is true data and correct data, and how much is false, is to be argued. But what's interesting about this exponential growth in data is it's between 80 and 90% of it that is daily produced is visual, unstructured data, so video or image. And a lot of what we're looking at now with leadership, which is a verbal communication, is we are quickly to leave behind the visual concepts of that leadership. Looking at the visual concepts of leadership, and in the Australian context of that is we look at how quickly we are to dismiss or judge people. Like Prime Minister at the moment, the perfect example is the smirk or the handshakes, or the fact that people didn't like Abbott because of the way that he walked, or, you know, Rudd flicked his hair too much. That, you know, those things were the undoing of a lot of people. And it wasn't that we dismissed the content of what they were saying. It's because we were judging them by this measure, which is visual. So understanding when you're a leader is how you stand. Do you position yourself behind a screen or in front of people? Are you standing up when they're sitting down, or are you sitting down with people? It's connecting to people on that really genuine level is this key concept of that sort of visual leader. And finally, it's building momentum. It's understanding basic physics. You know, to start something moving or to slow it down or change direction is where the energy is spent. And as an individual leader, you can't necessarily do that. So it's understanding how you build those around you to help people all row in the same direction, so to speak, or change the direction of a project or a message. It's understanding how you can best do that. And it's not, once again, it's not that calling the shots and telling people what to do. It's about being vulnerable, having that conversation, connecting with people genuinely allows you to then empower them to start helping you steer this ship and speed it up or slow it down when it needs to happen.
Awesome. So if I can try and disseminate that into 3 action items for you. The first one is essentially, you know, sort of taking a portrayal of a key message in a very human, connected way, and, you know, not being afraid of kind of fumbling it and stumbling it, and just essentially showing up as you are and being the leader that you are, as opposed to the sort of the persona of a leader that you believe you should, you know, put forward, or that your, you know, PR person is telling you should have. The second one is, you know, sort of being very aware and self-aware and conscious of, you know, sort of the visual impact, you know, especially at the moment when so many teams are in a virtual environment, but especially as and when isolation, you know, is over and you can come back physically, you know, with your groups, that, you know, as much, at least, if not more than what you say, is how you're visually sort of reinforcing the message. You know, are you the leader behind the podium, or are you the leader, you know, sort of sitting with the group? You know, to circle back to one of your, you know, sort of questions earlier, you know, in your culture, the elder is always sitting with the group as they're sharing the story. You know, they're not standing above the group or at a distance from them, you know, with our kind of traditional schoolyard portrayal of, you know, kids sitting on the ground in a circle looking up. You know,
Yeah.
The elder would be sitting down, you know, sort of sitting down with them as close and proximate as possible. So
Absolutely.
that visual engagement is crucial. And then finally, the you know, the opportunity of a leader to, again, to use your term from earlier, you know, sort of pull the levers of the team, and to get a connective and collective energy to provide the momentum to either sort of start or redirect or stop something from happening, that it's not on you. You don't have that much to give as a single person, regardless of how much power as a leader, you know, sort of you believe you may have. You're reliant on those around you and those in your team to actually get the basic physics, again, to use the term, to get things moving.
Absolutely.
Ben, that's been fabulous. Thank you for, as always, imparting so much knowledge and wisdom. What's the best way for people to find out more about what you're doing and get in touch with you?
Look, absolutely. We've got our website, which is for strategy for people who do a lot of tech, is very low tech. So www.sharedpath.org.au is where you find our website with information about us. But obviously through social media, we are always on Twitter and LinkedIn and that sort of stuff, pushing what's going on.
Okay, well, we'll have all of those links, you know, sitting there in the episode page. And in terms of, if people wanted to, sort of provide, some proactive support or even just some advocacy, what's the best way for people to get behind and get involved with what you're doing?
Look, once again, I'd say connect through social media. One of the biggest things we say around, especially Aboriginal Australia, is it's not talking for us. It's actually allowing us to have a bigger platform, or sharing your platform and microphone so we can spread the information to bigger networks. So look, jump on social media, jump on our webpage, have a chat with us, and then, yeah, absolutely share some of the work we're doing, or help us get out to more communities to get them connected.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Brother Ben. We'll wish you well and onward journey.
Thank you.